See, there's a huge difference between country living and wilderness living. I've lived in both territories, country and wilderness, and in the wilderness, it's a whole different ballgame than just living in the country per se. And so last night we were discussing some of the questions like what you do with the critters that come to your garden. When you're growing plants in the wilderness, there are critters that live in the wilderness that don't live in the country. And some of those critters can be skunks. Some of those critters can be cougars. And then where Jerry's at, I know there are plenty of grizzlies running around. And Jerry can tell you quite a few stories about their different pets that they've had, from Canadian geese to, I don't know whether other things. Yeah, you did have a skunk, I think, for a while. And so, anyway, let's talk about the critters.
Do you folks have Columbia ground squirrels here? They're not a true gopher. They're the size of a regular full tree squirrel, but they burrow in the ground. Their nests are all down in the ground. They live in the ground. They have been our hardest pest for a garden. They look just like a pine squirrel. The body's probably about like that for a full-grown one, plus the tail. They're the cutest little things. The Indians call them little red men because as soon as anything's approaching, they stand up on their hind legs, and then they go up and stand on their tiptoes and go up to try to see. They kind of look like a prairie dog, but they're not that big. They can dig. They're ferocious diggers, and they dig burrows in the ground. But when they come to your garden, they can easily climb your fence. I've only seen one climb a fence once, and that's because I was after him with a shovel at full speed, and he was in our garden. And we have, you'll see a picture tonight, but the fence is 6 feet high, but the first 3 feet has half-inch hardware on it, so he couldn't go through it, and that's the purpose, keep rabbits and all the little stuff out. They dig under it, but he knew he couldn't dig that fast, and so he literally just scrambled right up over the top and over. So they can climb, but they won't unless they're desperate. But they eat everything in your garden. And they're tenacious little guys, and we didn't know what to do. I'd say the first 4 or 5 years we had no problems. They didn't even know what a garden was. No one had ever gardened there, and they were no trouble. But somebody discovered it, and then they really started eating, and so we didn't have a fence around our garden at first. The deer didn't bother either until they learned what was in there. So they would dig under the fence, and I didn't try to put the fence 2 or 3 feet in the ground, and they can dig that deep anyway. I don't know how deep it'd have to be. It just goes down the ground a little bit, so they just can't go through. But they would dig under it, and I would immediately cover the hole up and pack dirt in there, and they would come back and usually dig out the same hole, same place again. Occasionally they would move. And then I got an idea. Just leave the hole and put a live trap on the other side with a couple of bricks like this and this, so when they come up their hole, the only place they have to go is straight in the trap. It works like a charm. And you don't have to bait it at all because they have a musk odor that they leave everywhere. And so, I mean, Uncle Jim has just been in here. This must be safe. And they just go whoosh, whoosh. Once we learned that, in the first year of that, we caught 100 around mostly our garden, but other buildings, because they'll dig under your buildings too if they can. The next year it was about 50, and then 30, 40, 30, and so on, and now we're down to a dull roar. We catch about 20, 25 a year. And they almost never get in the garden now, because I started putting the trap on the outside of the garden, just near where they go. They smell their cousins, and they go right in that, thinking that's the route. And I'll catch them, well, in the spring, once every day or two, and I haul them off the national forest. Some of them don't make it, but we got so good at it, bragging here again, we have caught 2 at the same time in one live trap. Now, how do you do that? Because as soon as one goes in, it's boom, it's like that. They were chasing each other, having fun, and they went in so fast that 2 got in before the door could get down. But we've just about solved that problem. But it will be a continuing problem until Jesus comes. A lot of my neighbors shoot them, but I don't like guns. Guns have killed a lot of people, just having them around your house and all that. And the poor little things, they're just trying to get something to eat. And the other nice thing about them is they will not go more than about 100 feet from their hole. So once you trap enough and trap them back 100 feet from your buildings and so on, I don't care if they're in the forest, and they stay in the forest. But every year they have lots of young in the spring, and then about mid-season, the teenagers are kicked out, and they have to go find, last year's brood, have to go find a new place. So they go out 50, 100 feet and dig a hole. And so they're right back to the door of my garden again, unless you would keep working your way out. The dogs chase them off a little bit and so on, but they were worse than deer, grizzly bears, or anything as far as total volume.
See, Jerry, tell us about some of your pets that Rochelle grew up with.
I got to tell you about taffers. We didn't go out looking for wild pets, and there's some laws even about that sort of thing. But in the spring one year, we were down about 30 miles south of our place at a bridge area. It goes over the river. We live near the North Fork River. It's called the North Fork Valley. It's the main Flathead River, and the Flathead River has 3 forks, north, middle, and south. The north and the middle are the 2 boundaries of Glacier National Park, ending at the Canadian border. So it was in spring flood, and the river was running absolutely full, and it was so full that it was mounded in the middle, probably 4 or 5 feet. You've seen rivers do that. It was just rolling in spring flood, and we went up. It was a Sabbath afternoon. I always took the kids out on Sabbath walks and so on, and we went up near the bridge. There's a bridge going over the river there, and Rochelle, who was probably 12 or 13 then, spotted a tiny little yellow fluff ball, probably this big. And we didn't know what it was. It looked like it was some sort of duck, but we didn't know. And we weren't going to take it if it was a family around. We could see nothing. Way upriver, we saw a couple of Canadian geese, but this guy had obviously gotten out, if he was part of that group, and had been swept down the river. When he got around the bridge, there was an eddy. It swept him in, and he was going in circles like this in this big eddy, and he was tired. He was about dead. Just a guy that big. So Rochelle waded out a little ways because it was in the eddy area, and he was at first afraid, but he was so weak, and she scooped him up, put it up. She had long hair, and put him on her shoulder right here. And within seconds, he bonded to her and figured, this is home, this is mom, I don't know, and snuggled under her hair and stayed that way. It was a Sabbath afternoon, stayed that way until we drove home, which was 30 miles, and when we got home, we have a fountain out in the middle of our Circle Drive that's natural gravity spring water, and the kids all got out, and there was green grass and all that of the van, and Rochelle set the little guy down on the lawn, and she was going to go over and wash her hands kind of in the overflow. The spring is not run by a pump, so it overflows and makes a stream. And the fountain. And all of a sudden the kids called and said, Rochelle, turn around. And here came this little fluff ball, yellow fluff ball, tumbling through the grass, trying to follow her. And she said, so she went and picked him up, or her, whoever, and said, okay, I guess it's mine. And she took it up to her bedroom. We made a little box, a light bulb, and keep it warm and all that. We had no idea what we had. And so she kept it and she fed it. What do you feed? She fed it like, bread with a little water and whatever we could think of, oatmeal. It would sit right on her desk when she would study, kind of under the light where it was kind of warm and kind of gnawed off like this. And every once in a while, he'd tip over. And she'd be studying, and then for some reason she'd have to go get something. She'd leave the desk. He would wake up, or she, and tumble off the desk trying to follow mom. Anyway, I could tell you so many wonderful stories about taffers, but taffers grew. And pretty soon it was outside and was nibbling on all kinds of things like dandelion greens and anything it could find. And it grew and it grew, and it became obvious after about 2 or 3 months that it was a Canada goose, is what it was. And called it taffy because, a taffy pull is you pull like this, and he was constantly sticking his neck out and doing this kind of thing like this. And we learned so many wonderful things. It had so many different calls, and little love calls, and come, I'm lonely, and others were squawks or whatever. They, of course, have a big honk. Didn't have a honk for a long time. Eventually, he started to grow feathers, and got rid of the down. Anyway, she taught him first. He followed her everywhere around our campus. And he would learn, and he was always eating. She'd learn what he liked, so she would have to every day get a grocery bag full of greens and put it there, and he would eat those greens. Some of the things that happened with him, when he got old enough, he went, you know how a teenage boy, their voice is kind of high, and then it starts squawking a little bit, and it's kind of, went through that very thing. He would go, like that, and start to honk, and it actually, he'd go, like, it scared him. And it took several weeks until he developed a full-throated honk, and then would always honk to tell Rochelle where he was. But he stayed with her just like a glove. Some of the crazy things that he did, eventually he got old enough where in feathers he'd start flopping his wings. I mean, he got this tall. I mean, it was a huge thing. And Rochelle said, well, I got to teach him to fly, because he walked everywhere. Because we walked. I mean, he was a person to him. He'd never seen a bird, and so she took him out in the Circle Drive, which is a big lawn, and finally she just threw him out like this, and he flopped his wings and kind of did a half somersault and just crash landed. Knew nothing. She kept at that till he started to be able to get a little balance, and finally she took him on top of our solarium, which is up nearly 20 feet. It was a big deal, because he could fly now, float a little bit, but she knew she had to help him eventually, and she took him up there, and all the other kids were watching and all this, and she did the big launch. And you should have seen him. I mean, it was like he was flopping back and forth, and he got his bearings a little bit, and he curved down and headed for the fountain and did a pretty lousy landing, but not a crash landing. And pretty soon he could fly. She would ride her bike around our area. We have some neighbors and a lot of little gravel roads. He would fly right beside her bike at right about head level, 4 feet, just flapping his wings like this. She would speed up, he would speed up. If she'd slow down, finally if she'd stop, he would coast down to a stop and stop right there until she went. He went everywhere with her. It was just wonderful. The guy, she kept him in the house for a long time, but they do drop a lot of bombs, as you know. And so she had a big box for him. She'd bring him in, big cardboard box. We'd be eating supper, and he would sit there, and eventually he would, he was like grumbling, I want out of here. And all of a sudden he'd jump and fly out and land. And she'd run, and Taffers, you get back in your box. And you should have seen him. He'd scamper right back, right over the top. And he was like a naughty teenager, but he has so much personality. And then winter came, or fall, he was full grown, could fly anywhere. He would fly, you'll see in the pictures tonight, our house is up on a hill and overlooks the meadow where the fountain and all our gardens and stuff is. And he would launch off from the house area. He'd fly all the way through the woods down there and land down there. He could fly wherever, but he didn't want to leave. Finally, we saw Canadian geese going over, and they were going south, and they were honking, and he would look up. And so we tried to get him interested, and Rochelle would try to throw him up and, go, she wanted him to be wild if he wanted to be wild. He wasn't interested in a bit. One day, this was real late in the fall, and we already had probably 6 or 8 inches of snow, and it was down cold. It was a Sabbath, and it was supposed to go to 10 below Fahrenheit that night. And some geese came over, and he took off and flew down, but this time he didn't land down in our meadow. He just kept going, and Rochelle could see him out the window, and it was her baby. And she cried. It's like, Daddy's gone. What am I going to do? And she said, he doesn't know how to catch up with him or anything, and it's going to be 10 below. He's going to freeze to death. And so she took off, got her coat on, and we hunted and called, because if you called him off in the wood, he'd be off in the woods often, and he would honk to let you know where he was, and then she could find him. Nothing. And finally, we went clear down, probably a half a mile from our house, down close to the river. We heard a faint honk. and went over. Here he was in the snow, he was cold, he was shivering, and Rochelle went over to pick him up. He just snuggled his big old head against her neck, and that was the last time he ever tried to migrate. So what are you going to do with a goose all winter? So we have a pretty good sized pool in our greenhouse, and so we put him in the solarium. He lived in there. He would swim in there. He loved it in there. And we take him out in the winter, and the kids used to ski down our road. We have quite a hill on and down. He would fly right beside them as they skied, flying with them. And then when they stop, he'd try to land while he's on snow and ice. I didn't realize they have claws. Some of you know this. I didn't know that. They have claws on their pads, and they have really good grip. And he could stop, skeeter just like that. The other thing, couple things he did at that time, I was milling beams to build another building, big beams like 27 feet long, 6x8s with a chainsaw. And I was milling up on the hill where a couple trees had fallen. He could hear that chainsaw, knew where I was. He would fly in and he would circle above the woods till he'd go over like this till he saw where I was, and then he'd find his path and he would crash land going through all, because it was heavy woods, wings hitting the spruce boughs and everything else, and he'd land, and then he'd come up on the road and he had this kind of friendly howl, and he was so proud of himself for landing. He would get on the log where I was trying to mill, and it's a chainsaw mill, and I was pushing it through, and it's spitting out this constant stream of sawdust. He would sit there right on the mill with a chainsaw running full bore, totally noisy, and I have earmuffs and everything, and he's down here trying to get mouthfuls of sawdust. He would walk along 20 feet till I got to the end, and then the whole thing, the slab was going to fall off, and I'd have taffers. He wouldn't leave. I had to push him off, and he'd scold me to no end till I could get back on and start eating more sawdust. He was the craziest guy. One day we were in Friday night, and it was warm, and Rochelle had her bedroom's upstairs, and it had a door out to a little porch. She'd left the door open. Didn't really think about that. He was outside. We didn't leave him in very much. We started singing songs for Friday night vespers or Sabbath night vespers. I can't remember which. All of a sudden, there was this huge honk in the house. And our home has it's a loft upstairs and overlooks, the living room with big beams and all this sort of stuff. He had flown up, he'd heard us. He'd flown up to her porch, walked in through her room, come to the banister, stuck his neck through, and honked as loud as he could, as I'm here, I want to be part of this. He did that kind of thing over and over. One of the curious things is the next spring when we started to garden, of course by then he could fly. He molted, but then he could fly again. We'd be out in the garden, and we had just planted Swiss chard and kale and lettuce, and of course the weeds are coming up in between, and it's hard. You got to pick each weed out and not pick the lettuce starts and all this sort of, and stuff was up, maybe that high. He flew in the garden, and he wanted to help. And I knew, he ate greens. He was just going to mow down the whole row of stuff. And so I ran over there, and I took some weeds and threw them over there to give him, and he went over and gobbled them right up. Pretty soon, he went to a row, and he picked what I had thrown, and he would pick every weed and leave every good plant. And I said, this is nirvana. This is wonderful. And he did that for I don't know how many days. He did that. And then one day, he was out there weeding. You know what's coming. He missed and grabbed some real lettuce. His whole expression changed, and he started gobbling lettuce like we've been picking the wrong thing. And I went over there, taffers, and he squawked, and he ran down picking as many mouthfuls as he could till I got to him, and then he took off. And that was the end of his weed picking career, because he didn't realize, he was trying to tell me, we've been picking the wrong stuff all this time. What a guy. Our dog at the time, Nikki, would go ground squirreling, because I talked about these ground squirrels, and we let her do it. She'd go try to dig them out. We let her do that, try to push them back in the woods. and she'd dig quite a hole. Taffers learned that. He went with Nicky out in the woods, and they'd be gone hundreds of feet out in the forest, and once in a while we hear Taffers out there give a honk. They would come back, Nicky walking first. Nicky's nose would be totally covered with dirt. Taffers would be right behind, and his whole head was covered with dirt. And I went out and watched him one time. Nicky would dig and dig and dig and whatever and get tired. Taffer, his neck was this long. He'd stick his neck all the way down the hole, look, saying, come out, and wah, 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 you're telling Nicky what to do next. And they would dig ground squirrels for hours. It was the cutest thing, and I should probably leave it there.
What happened to it?
Yeah, I was afraid you'd ask that. So we had him well over a year. It was into the next summer. Rochelle learned from Linda how to lay rock, because we did all our own work, and we knew we had to lay our own rock, and we'll show you. Some of it wasn't great to start with, but Linda learned to be a great mason and taught Rochelle to be too, and one of the neighbors saw that, and mason work's expensive to get a regular mason, so he hired Rochelle to build some huge stone pillars for him, and it was a job lasted a couple of months. And so she would often go over to, they were next door neighbors, and I mean, still like a quarter mile away or half a mile. And she was over there working, and she would often take Nicky, our dog, with her because she wanted company, because she did several times while she was there, standing on these things ended up, they were 3 feet square and probably 9 or 10 feet high eventually. And so she was on a scaffold lifting these big river rock and placing them and all this. And she'd stop, three times this happened, stop and look on, and just 20 feet away in the woods was a big grizzly bear just standing there watching her, and she didn't even know. And you know, it can be a little frightening. So she wanted Nicky there to tell her, the dog, when a bear was around. So Nicky often went, but Nicky would just sit there all day, and it got boring, and she'd come home. This particular day, I was in the solarium, and we still were doing stone work and other things in there, and I was working in there because it wasn't finished yet. And the door was open. You'll see in the pictures tonight, it's a big door, and it looks like a house on the backside. And that was open, and Taffers often just sat out in the lawn, probably not more than 20 feet from the door, and would just sit there and kind of, they have this kind of tweety little sound that's just like comforting. You know, I'm okay, and just let you know where I'm at. It's not honking or anything. And he would just be pulling weeds out of the lawn or grass and just eating a little bit, just sitting there. Nicky had gone with Rochelle that day and had not come back, so Nicky was not there. And all of a sudden I heard this horrible honking, and I was afraid of what it was. I got up from what I was doing. I was like 30 feet from the door or something. I ran out fast as I could. As soon as I got the door, I looked where the honking, and here was a wolf with Taffers in its jaws, running away. I ran as fast as I've ever run, yelling and screaming, but I couldn't catch that wolf. Poor Taffers. Rochelle was heart sick. You know, she learned to love that little animal just like another person. It was her companion, everything. But you know, in this old world, that's sin. That's just the way it is. Can't blame the wolf. It's hungry too. We later found the feathers and whatnot, and she's still in her bedroom in our home, even though she has her own home now. There's this big urn sitting there with Taffers feathers out of it. So seldom do wildlife stories have happy endings. But for that year and 2 months, it was like heaven. It really was. So that's one of the best stories that we have of wild animals.
We had a pet when we were in Montana. On a Sabbath morning, there was a screaming sound. And the boys came running and they said, there's a mountain lion out there, Dad. So we went running towards the screaming sound, grabbed an axe going by the woodshed, and we almost fell over a baby fawn, just about that big. And the neighbor's dog had found it and was biting at it, and that's why it was screaming. And a fawn can scream just as loud as a mountain lion. They can really give a loud scream sound. So anyway, we adopted this little deer because we had heard this sound before, And so evidently, I don't know where the mother was. She may have gotten killed, roadkill, or whatever. So we adopted this deer, and of course it was Bambi. And the boys raised this Bambi deer, and we had a lot of fun. It knew its name. It would follow you around like a dog. It would go in the house, up and down, and we kept it in the front entryway. And sure enough, their feces has zero odor. And we found out that a baby deer can live on lamb replacement milk. Don't feed them cow's milk. They don't thrive on cow's milk, but they like lamb replacement milk. So we kept it for, I think, most of a year, and then we heard that if you keep a wild animal and make it tame, there was a hefty fine of, I think it was $300 or $500 from the game warden if you get reported. Well, we didn't have that kind of money at that time, and so we turned it loose. And it was, at that time, probably 3/4 grown. And so it could make its way quite well. But how do you prepare a deer to cope with the bear and the other animals that are out there? And so it ended up missing. And we finally found its jawbone, and some bear had gotten a hold of it. Because how do you teach a young deer to run from a bear? You know, there's just no way to communicate. But the pets that you can have in the wilderness is really rewarding, and we just had more fun. It would suck your ear, almost pull it off, and it would take a bottle just like nobody's business, and it was just a lot of fun. And that was, have you ever had any experiences with a deer? Tell us about your bear. You had some grizzlies up there.
Well, this isn't really, grizzlies do dig under our fence, and they like carrots. That's the only thing they're after, and we have had one now for 3 or 4 years. Comes back about the second week of September, because that's when the carrots will be ripe. And he thanks us for planting them and watering them and weeding them. It's a 120-foot row, though, so it's a lot of carrots. And fortunately for us, we discovered that he could only eat 20 or 30 feet of carrots in one sitting, and then his stomach was so full he couldn't eat anymore, so he left. But they always come back the next night. So Linda and I, of course, go down there and madly dig carrots the next day, and they weren't, unfortunately, they need to go another week or two. They're not fully grown and fully sweet, but they're pretty good. Cleared them all out, and sure enough, he came back and harmed nothing else except he punctured a couple holes in some plastic we had, but didn't eat anything else. Mostly they're just a scare because grizzly bears, if cornered, as you know, can be very lethal. One experience I had, I was working in the garden, and I happened to look up, and we have a fence around the garden. Looked out in our circle drive. You'll see the configuration tonight, but there was a grizzly bear coming right across the lawn. So I quickly got up on the fence, and right where the gate into the garden is, we have a nice little higher thing with a little, cute little roof over it, and that's up at about 8 feet, and I figured that was the only protection I had because he could easily come through the fence. So I crawled up in there, and fortunately from there, we have cleared it so you can look all the way up the hill, clear to the front windows in our house, and it's big windows, like 14 feet tall and all this, and I figured, it's only going to be a matter of a few minutes or 10 or 15, and Linda's going to be looking down there, and she's going to see me madly waving. Because I stood on top of that with the grizzly right in front of me, maybe 30 feet away, and he was munching on clover. And he acted like he didn't even care about me. Oh, thank you. I waved, must have looked totally stupid because I was standing there waving for all I was worth and shouting. Linda never saw me. I was there for a good half an hour. With the bear, he was just out there. He would lay down, he would munch, because we have clover in with the grass. He would munch it until he munched so much that his stomach started to feel full. And finally, after about 30 minutes, he wandered off. He never paid any attention to me. And I crawled down, and I won't tell you what I said when I got to the house. I'll tell you one other one. Just recently, I went down in the morning. No wolf, no bear, nothing in sight. I opened the garden gate, and it's a really big garden, and I opened the gate, and I usually don't leave it open, but I opened it and left it open because all I was going to do was go around behind the garden. We have a big 120-foot supply building that's full of firewood and plywood and lumber and everything that you need, but you don't want anybody to see. And it's all south-facing. The wall is. It's open on the other side. So I went to get some lumber that I was working on a little project in the garden. And I went around, clear around the building, 120 feet down there, but I just opened it, walked around, probably took me 2 minutes, picked a piece of lumber out, slid it through the fence on the other side, and just as I slid it through, I was startled to see a grizzly bear in the middle of the garden. You think about it, he was there, invisible, wherever, in 2 minutes from the time I opened the gate and just walked around the back of this little building and put a piece of lumber through. He'd come out of the woods, found the open gate, and was in the garden. That quick. So now what? Because my only place of real safety was the solarium, which was having to walk past the garden to that. And the other problem is bears have this notorious problem that they can never remember how they got in a building or a garden. And they get excited and they go to wherever they think is the best place and they tear up whatever's there to get out. And I didn't want him to tear my fence all up if I could help it. We had P fences, 3 rows, 120 feet long, that the P's were up maybe this much, so it wasn't a lot there, but they crawl up the fences. So that was there. Anyway, I saw him and it took him maybe 10 seconds to see me. And instantly when he saw me, stood up, like they do, and started wagging his head and take in the situation. And I told him, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you, and all that. And instantly he ran for the fence, which I was afraid of, took some swats, and it's a pretty strong fence. He couldn't get through immediately, and he ran around the garden for a while until he finally remembered where the hole was and headed out. And I think if you remember, but Linda had come down, right, about then with our dog, and she'd been maybe in the solarium, was in the orchard greenhouse. She came out, and I yelled at her because the grizz had just come out of the garden, was right there, and probably only 100 feet from her. And she saw the situation. So now what to do? And we're trying, Chloe was young then, she's a big Malamute, and we're trying to train her to chase grizzlies. And she was still a little afraid of them. She was very young. And I finally got around garden, and the bear's now 100 or 200 feet away, but not wanting to leave. And so I tried to sick Chloe on it. And finally I got Chloe to get the situation, go chase this bear. She finally took off like real, like she was big stuff, growling and barking, and ran up to the bear. And the bear ran just a little bit, turned around. Instantly, Chloe ran right back to me and right between my legs. No, that's not the way we do this. Anyway, she finally got the picture and kept barking, and finally the grizzly took off. Now she and Misty, the other Malamute, they'll tree any bear. Mostly black bears, because grizzlies can't. When they're full grown, they can't climb trees because they're too heavy. I have some pictures tonight of them treeing a bear right in the front yard. They love to do that. So they are helpful. The dogs are very helpful with bears. We've never had a problem grizzly. I mean, I've come around a corner and they're 20 feet away, and there's nothing you're going to do. But as long as they're not cornered, they've never tried to attack anybody. They usually just try to run. I had another experience this is just, I think last summer. I was walking around the gardens, and all of a sudden the deer came running out of the woods right towards me, full bore. Didn't act like it even saw me, ran right past me. I should have thought, I didn't, but there's a bear chasing that deer. It didn't click. I went kind of the direction where it had come from, which is where our powerhouse is, that we have our hydroelectric plant. I only got back in a little ways, and there was a bear right there. So the animals know what's going on. I think it's wonderful. At first we were scared. I saw a bear behind every tree, But now, if you treat them right, they actually are a wonderful thing to see. We actually, I don't know why, but we see more grizzlies on our place than we see black bear. And there are way more black bears in the woods. But I think they're a little more skittish.